even in financial services companies, there's some level perhaps of immunity to some microeconomics, but regardless if it's an upturn cycle or a recession, I rarely have seen that we will put the level of investment to solve all the problems out there or implement all the business cases. So while I've done large transformational programs, they do require a lot of focus, a lot of allocation of energy and budget. So what we're doing at HSB is we're really doing kind of a step-by-step modernization approach to transform the environment, improve efficiencies, and avoid costs. So, really what we're doing now, well in advance of even next year, is working with the business executive leadership and their key stakeholders, coming up with a wish list, triaging it down, and then kind of coming up with what I like to use the word balanced and pragmatic approach that will move the needle forward on various capabilities that we will hope that will bring that transformation and disruption for us.
Modernization versus transformation, right? And I think the experience has been when it's transformation, it's easy to find funding and it's easy to build a business case. When you get into modernization, it becomes a lot more challenging, right? And what we have at BFL is we do have an investment management process around how we do our portfolio planning for the year. And it's somewhat similar to what Mike described previously in terms of, the business benefits being articulated and the costs and the triage, prioritization, and so forth. The reason I mentioned the distinction between the transformation and the modernization is because the modernization tends to be more on the technical side in many cases, right? And so what we've learned is that, it's really critical for us to include consideration for technical debt in those business cases also. So specifically for infrastructure upgrades or replacements and so forth, they need to be part of the costing, which, as you can imagine, and I'm sure we all experience, this is generally met with a lot of challenge, right? And so unfortunately, I think what we find is the technology teams are very often reluctant to include this in the cases, in the business cases. But what we have to realize is that the business really relies on us to do the right thing for the organization, right? And it brings us to the point of informing and educating our stakeholders on the importance of this, right? And so, speaking back into your point, in business terms around the effects of not doing it, the effects on service, the effects on brand, the effects of compliance or fines due to data breaches and so on by not modernizing it brings the conversation to a much better place in terms of demonstrating true business value, right? And so not just a technical modernization. The reality is it doesn't always pan out, right? And business conditions and funding decides whether or not we do include that. But having a proper method in terms of managing that technical debt and ensuring that if it doesn't get funded in this round, it comes forward again and eventually gets addressed. That's been a pretty key way for us to ensure that the modernization continues.
I think I have a lot in common with what Chris and Mike talked about already. And one of the key I'm trying to nurture is really to build the partnership with the line of business so that we can truly understand their problem statement. Because at the end of the day, we're here to deliver business value. So understand their problem is my key. And in the past, we had a lot of silo. Each year, they submit their business plan and say, hey, I need that, $1 million to implement something. However, we're trying to change to create visibility through standardization. We created a business template for them to build a case. So everybody is using a standardized template. So everybody, have to think through some of the attributes like, what is your business requirement, dependency, what are your forecasts on your hard dollar or even soft dollar saving, tangible, intangible. And we do everything that is in such a way that they just need to type it in so that we build all the fancy graph for them already. And with that, we had some success in a way that there was a department comes to us, goes, I need $500,000 to build an SAP platform. I want to onboard my whole team. But it turned out because I was able to line up with the enterprise architect together, when technology and business people talk, it's a win to me. And we're able to give them a much cheaper solution. You talk about Microsoft 365. we're able to use that, which is already what we have, and save almost $500,000 rather than onboarding SAP. Then we can use some solutions that we already have for them. So I think this is a win-win. And lastly, I also want to mention that as we're able to build the confidence, we're able to corral the whole branch together and create a pipeline so that the whole board are aware of what we're doing as a technology and kind of help them to propel the business.
So as I'm working with a lot of CIOs across the board, is to make this not a silver bullet. You know what I mean? Like, hey, do this and it'll fix all your problems. It's drive this a little bit more as a program. So for Crowdbotics, we think code reuse has to be systemic throughout your entire organization. I think I've heard here is like, hey, we can really control the CI/CD side of the house and the automation portion, but the entire application lifecycle needs to kind of be addressed that way. So when we look at this in every organization, is quantifying this differently, is be able to hit this on a roadmap. So we say in 2 years, we can get you to 70% of code reuse, right? And from there, you can look at, hey, by reusing codes and modules, how much time that you potentially save a developer from reinventing the wheel. So you've kind of, now you can move into kind of hard returns, which could be speed to deploy, trust, code quality, anything like that that you can quantify. And now you can start marrying that with your subjective or sentiment data. Are developers happier, right? Is the business feel more agile? Do I feel more innovative around those items? So when we work specifically around that, we find that getting into code reusability specifically is an easy thing to quantify back from a rate of return. It's an easy strategy to nail down and then be able to focus where you want to implement that, no matter where your organization is from a legacy and new app deployment and all that. And then for us, the last thing that kind of amplifies this a little bit more is owning the code and exposing the code for ownership. That's going to really change because now you have shadow IT is becoming a cost structure. The adoption of how people might structure and build applications in a low code and no code environment. We think the world has to be built, not configured into that, because in the next 2 years, like this is where we are in a paradigm shift. The cloud was the first paradigm shift. Now this area of where code allocation, code development, and code quality, good or bad, is coming. So you have to restructure what that cost model is. The fact is that you have to unlock more budget to be innovative. That has to happen in the future. Here is there's a lot of money already set to IT budgets. How do we sit there and re-exercise so that we can recycle that back in order to just innovate more for what you have? And we think code reusability will do that, and it's more tangible and quantifiable in order to do that over time, in order to hit that nirvana state that I think some of you have already talked about.
We do it because we don't have a framework or lack of a framework. Basically, how do we respond to our ROIs? We are a heavy use of SaaS products. Our business basically relies on that. I think it's 158 or so. It's somewhere around there is our SaaS usage that we do outside. But the way we actually approach it is not, we don't do all the development for our team. Some of our team members are the business side. They do heavily rely on usage of external SaaS. So what we do from an ROI perspective, in the sense that we don't have a framework for that, what we do is we work with the business very closely and kind of rationalize. And I'm gonna pick on what Gini says, something like Office 365 has capability of tons of different things, and we actually work with business to understand if they can replace it with this one. And we basically rationalize as much as we can our SaaS ecosystem. That's how we respond to the ROI. So much so that the framework would probably help, but I don't think the way our business is operated, very separate, and the ecosystem of that, it may not apply using a one methodology or a framework in that regard.
For Sun Life, what we had realized is a lot of our conversations were not anchored towards value. So we have actually moved to a value realization framework. What that means from an ROI perspective, it's basically 4 pillars. First is orchestration of all the best practices, standards in the organization, how we can bring things together. You can imagine Sun Life is very complex with different regional businesses. So that's one. The second is how do we get the change agent attitude for all our employees, customer facing mindset, and how are we driving the change? The third is in terms of value realization, we are changing the conversations to focus more on outcomes and the business values for the initiatives that we are doing. Very hard emphasis on business casing. Dollar, it's not always dollar. It could be cost avoidance instead of revenue, as an example. So we are holding the leaders accountable for the cost takeouts. And the last is around we can't improve what we can't measure. So there's a big emphasis on automation, tooling, driving the OKR culture so that we can measure the value. So all the conversations are leading up to a value outcome with evidence and inspection rather than feelings, and it's a good for us to do.